everybody. Oh, I am wearing a hoodie because it is chilly outside for once. um, Thanks for joining me this Friday. It is I am broadcasting to you from Pennsylvania. If you can't hear me so well, let me know. Otherwise, I will get started. Feel free to put in the comments whenever you like questions you might have, and I'll get to them when I can. I am sick again for the second time since I arrived in Pennsylvania 4 weeks ago. It is incredibly annoying, really sick. So I apologize for coughing. All right, so I just wanted to touch on how much honey to leave your bees. And then, even though that is a topic you usually talk about more so in the fall and before you close your hive up for winter, it's important to know how much honey you want to leave your bees so you don't harvest too much, which is, you might have done already or you might be thinking about. So I'm just going to go touch on that a little bit, and then I'll talk about feeding your bees in this late summer, fall period. But I also have a link. I just put it right there in the comments. It's the first comment right here, the link to my YouTube video about feeding your bees. And that's a long one, but in the video description, it has links to the different parts. So there's a link to the fall and late summer feeding. And then I see that Jim says, besides feeding, can we touch on what is considered the right approach for Varroa treatment during fall and prior to winter? So remind me if I forget to touch on that too. All right, so how much honey to leave your bees? I mean, you can go one approach and leave it all. There's a good chance a lot of people that are beekeepers have their beehives in places where their bees aren't gathering enough honey. It's an unfortunate thing that we just have to accept in this country, is that a lot of this country is, we're surrounded by food deserts for pollinators, grass, parking lots, malls. Even, as we were searching for a home, my family and I, a lot of the properties, they're 3 acres, 5 acres, but most of it is just heavily wooded forest. People just want privacy. So there's just tons of tall trees, but those little flowers aren't popping up down there because it's too dark. There's not much food. There's not a lot of flowers for bees. So for most of you guys, there's a really good chance that your bees are going to need all of the food that they brought in, or most of it, and then also you're going to add the supplement. If you don't like that answer, or you think you have enough food for your bees, like Jim, who has this magical spot, it sounds like, and he was able to do a great harvest. A lot of the country, they need, a general rule of thumb is at least 35 pounds. And that is not including the boxes or the frames. That is the wax and the honey. If you are going to leave all of the food in your hive, weigh it. Weigh the frames before you close it up for winter, just so you know what you have, so you know for next year. If you live in a colder climate, so Pennsylvania, 35 pounds for a lot of people is sufficient, especially if you're not in the Pittsburgh area where it's a bigger, longer winter. But if you're looking at some of the more northern states that have a longer winter, then they're leaving up to 50 pounds of honey. Now, if you are able to leave if your bees are gathering over 50 pounds of honey to leave in the hive, and you have enough to harvest, then good for you. But probably most people aren't really even have the option to have that much more left on their hives. If you are in the southern states, then you can probably get away with a lot less. What I did in Hawaii was I harvested most of my honey. I left that second brood box on my hives. Usually the first brood box was totally full of brood, maybe a frame of honey and pollen. The second brood box was usually 50% full-ish of brood and the rest was honey. And that was usually sufficient for winter time, and I pulled the rest. But I always left, um, the equivalent of maybe 3 to 4 frames per hive in a chest freezer. I have had a large chest freezer ever since the first year I started keeping bees in Hawaii. And I always make sure that I have backup frames in a chest freezer. So if you live in an area where it is warm enough that you can open your beehive and throw honey into your hive, you can not harvest your honey, but pull it off the hive and store it somewhere else. Now, for warm climates, the reason why you do that is because, 1 second. My mother's washing dishes. We have to find a rental. We were hoping to find a place to live by now, but we're going to have to just start renting. Anyway, if you are in a warm climate where you do not have a frost, you're going to have to pull your honey off and leave them, like half a box of honey, and you're going to need to hold on to that honey as feed possibly later on. But you don't want to leave too much honey on, or small hive beetles will take over your hive. So it's also good to join a local association. Like I saw here in the area I am, the Bucks County Beekeepers Association also has, like, when you become a member, they have like a little question portal or something where you can post questions. A lot of the beekeeping associations have a Facebook page where you can post questions. So that's also another great place, if you can't go to an in-person meeting, to join some kind of club in your area to get a feel for how much honey to leave. And it's tricky because it's not going to be, the bees aren't going to need the same amount of honey every year, because it's not just the food that they're eating because there's nothing out flowering together. It's this weird balance that they have within the hive. So when they're in that tight cluster, they are eating food, but they're not consuming as much food because they're not using much energy. And their goal is to use up as little energy as possible. But when it warms up, they will leave that cluster in search of food or the hive, or leave the hive to go on a cleansing flight. So like here in Philly, there are a lot of days throughout the winter where it warms up and it's like 50 degrees out and sunny. And just like all of us are running outside in a t-shirt thinking it's super warm, the bees are leaving the hive and they're using up energy. And the more energy they use up, the more food they need. And so then they'll eat into a lot of the food storage if you have a lot of those warm days in between cold days. And then there's also springtime. So you think that you survive the winter, the bees have enough to get through that little bit of winter. But if your springtime comes and it's super rainy and there's not going to be any flowers blooming for a while, then that's a common time for bees to starve to death, because they're out looking for food. It's warm out. They're using up energy. They're eating up all the food in the hive, and they're not finding anything. So you really want to leave them a good basic level is at least 35 pounds, but you also want to just keep checking on the hive. You can just, when you close it up, give that hive a little push to get a feel for the weight of it. And throughout the winter, you will see that the weight just decreases over time. They're also, the name is, the word for it's like a thermal, you can see the heat within the hive, so that'll tell you where the cluster is in your hive. I forget what those things are called, and that will let you know where the bees have gone in the hive and whether they are already up at the top. Those things are helpful as well. And then you always have your backup source of your candy or dry white sugar under the lid of your hive, but you just don't want that to be the primary food source and just take everything and leave them a couple frames, because that's not healthy for the bees, and That's just a little wrong. um, uh, so, desperate prepper. I'm not ignoring your comments, your questions, but they are about prepping your hive for winter. And I wanted to talk about feeding your bees and leaving honey on the hive first because that's the topic. And for most people, they're not really having to bother with overwintering their hive yet. So right now, what we need to deal with, in addition to making sure we don't take too much honey from the hive and harvesting too much, is feeding your bees. Now, I'm seeing goldenrod blooming all over the place around here. If you're not familiar with goldenrod, it is kind of like a weed that grows all over on the sides of the highway and everywhere. It has these tiny little yellow flowers, and the bees love it. The honey is not very good, but in my opinion, but it is a great fall food source for the bees. So once the bees are bringing in a whole bunch of that, hopefully you've harvested your honey by then because it was probably time for you to do that. And you can start feeding. If you have a ton of goldenrod and your bees are still bringing in lots of food, then feeding might not be necessary. But when you start feeding is going to be once you have harvested your honey. You don't want to feed your bees before you harvest because that syrup is it shouldn't be mixed in with honey. It's not going to taste good. It's going to make your honey not taste good. So do a harvest if you are going to, and then consider feeding. So the feeding, there's two main reasons why you would feed in the late summer and fall. And one is to prevent them from eating their winter storage. Winter storage is, it's going to be the capped honey frames at the top of the hive, and it's there for when they need it. And so if you feed them syrup, then they can just survive on that and leave those frames be until they need them in the wintertime. The second reason is that this late summertime, early fall is when the winter bees are being produced. So the queen starts laying eggs for winter bees, usually like August. And these winter bees are a little bit different than the worker bees that are in the hive the rest of the year. They are meant to live for months, as the worker bees the rest of the year aren't. They have a lifespan of 6 to 8 weeks. The winter bees are have a higher fat deposits. Their makeup is just a little bit different. And so you really want this population of winter bees to be as high as possible. The more winter bees you have, the easier it's going to be for them to cluster up and produce heat and to keep the queen warm and the brood warm when she starts laying and all of that. So don't be concerned if in wintertime you start to see all these dead bees on your bottom board, because you're going to have a whole bunch of the non-winter bees dying, and that's just what happens. So you want these winter bees to be as healthy as possible. You can feed them syrup, which is 1 part water to 1 part sugar, and that is by volume. So it's in the video. The link is right there in the first comment. But you heat up water. You don't have to on the stove, but it's faster, especially if you're making a large amount of it. You heat up the water to boiling, then you can take it off boiling, add in the sugar, however much you want. It can be a gallon, it can be 2 cups, whatever you want. Stir it up until it is dissolved, and then take it off the heat so that it is not so hot anymore. And once it's not hot anymore, then you want to add a supplement to help the bees digest it. So I've always used Honeybee Healthy, mostly because I just bought a big bottle years ago and it's lasted a long time. And you can add an amino boost if you like as well, which is also sold from that Honeybee Healthy website. Now, the amino boost is just an extra supplement. I think it has a little bit of protein in it as well. And so if you want, you can also add a little bit of dried protein, not It's, not, don't get it from like a health food store, just any kind of dried pollen protein. But you can add like this, it's either dried or dehydrated, I'm not sure, but you get it from beekeeping supply sites. You can add a little bit of that to it as well, or a little bit of a pollen patty if you have some, or not give them any pollen at all. The pollen is shouldn't be necessary. Your hive should have ample pollen in it, but if you're just not seeing it for whatever reason, you can give them a little bit of it. The pollen is to help with the brood production. So this is all just to make sure that you have a good winter bee population. Um, Now, where you feed your bees can be a little bit tricky because depending on the size of your hive and how much there was blooming and how active your bees were, there's going to be this time at which the bees have to go through this transition period from like everybody's happy, lots of stuff to do, the hives are full, everyone's got stuff going on, to less food. And then at that transition period, your bees get cranky. The hive is crowded because not as many bees are leaving the hive to go off and search for food. So you might even see bearding around the hive. The queen will slow down in her laying, and everything goes back into balance, but it's kind of like off balance for a little bit. And so they can be a little bit overly aggressive. And at that time, then there can be robbing that goes on, which then means that bees are going to other beehives and trying to steal from them. And if you have a few beehives very close to each other, then it's really easy for the bees to rob the beehive that's a foot away. And so when this happens, you want to be careful with feeding. You definitely don't want to use an entrance feeder. But when you add that amino boost, the smell, the bees just really smell it. So if you are noticing that robbing is going on, if the bees are aggressive, if you're seeing them stinging each other on the front step, if you're seeing a whole lot of dead bees at the front entrance or right below the front entrance on the ground, then you might want to have a feeder as far away from the bees as you can get. So if you have like a 1 acre property, then just put it on the other end of the property. If you have like 20 acres, then okay, just put it a good enough distance that even if it does attract attention from wasps and other bees, they're not flying over your beehives and seeing that there's also this spot too that they can go rob. You just, I mean, I don't have a specific amount of distance. It depends. Like if there's a whole bunch of trees or is this a wide open space, you just want to use a little bit of your own intuition to figure out what is a good distance that you're not causing too much, bringing too much attention to your hives. And you just want the feeder away. Or you can just not add that amino boost, maybe add just a little bit of Honey Bee Healthy and put it inside the hive and just monitor it and check to make sure that you're not seeing a lot of aggression or robbing. And if it's not warm out, then you can always reduce the entrance. I mean, you definitely should be reducing the entrance, especially if it's getting cooler out at night, to keep the rodents from getting in. Uh, and then in that case, make sure your entrance reducer is metal and not wood. And just make sure that you're not doing more harm than good by feeding your bees. Now, some people will feed 2-to-1 sugar to water, which means 2 parts sugar, 1 part water instead. You can do that. I mean, we're not talking about whether this is life or death for the bees. People that feed 2-to-1 sugar syrup aren't killing their bees, and the people that are feeding 1-to-1 aren't having all their bees survive. This isn't like the what's going to make or break anything for you. It's just, some people think that they would rather give the bees a higher concentration of sugar than the bees. There's less work for them to evaporate the moisture, and you can do that once it's fall or once it's closer to when the syrup's going to come out of the hive. But when the queen is still producing winter bees, still laying eggs, you should have it at a 2-to-1 syrup because that is the recipe for growth. 2-to-1 simulates nectar coming in from somewhere, and adding those additional boosters just helps encourage growth. Then there is a point at which everything slows down and the queen is laying very little, and that's when you can transition to the 2-to-1 sugar syrup, or you can continue with the 1-to-1, but also just get rid of any kind of pollen and amino boost. You don't want to encourage the queen to be laying eggs at that point, because she knows what she's supposed to be doing, and you have to let the production stop at some point. I do have a video that I'm going to be posting this weekend. It is called When, and it's a video I filmed when I was in Hawaii, and it's all about like when to do what, when to feed bees, when to stop, when to pull honey, when to add supers, all of those things, so you can just understand how timing works in beekeeping and in a broader scale as opposed to a smaller scale, because that was I'm trying to do some beekeeping theory videos for you guys, because I think that was one of the hardest things for me was I could never find a video that was perfect for me and my situation and my problem. It was always like, well, this person's somewhere where it's really cold and I have 2 hives and they have 20 and they can do this, or this person has a top bar hive and I don't have the option to do this with it. So I'm trying to explain to you a little bit more why we do what we do as a beekeeper, so that you can problem solve a little bit better on your own and understand what's necessary and what's not necessary. Because some things aren't really that big of a deal. You can do it the same way I did it because it's not that big of a deal, and with other things you have to do it a little bit differently. So that's why beekeepers will feed in this late summer, early fall time. Like late summer, they're really just trying to encourage growth of the winter bees, that production. And so as Jim asked, he asked if we can touch on what's considered the right approach for Varroa treatment during fall and prior to winter. I mean, you want to treat after you harvest your honey. It can be a little bit earlier than maybe is necessary, but you don't want to do it too late, because you want to have these winter bees as healthy as possible. And so the Varroa mites, over 90% of Varroa mites are in cells feeding off of pupa. So if the queen is laying eggs for winter bees now, you have a few weeks before they are pupa, and you want the hive to be very low Varroa mite levels so that you don't have all these mites feeding off of the pupa winter bees. These pupa have mites feeding off of them. Well, okay, at the very end of the larva stage, that's when they sneak in right before they cap the cell. Then when they cap the cell, they're hiding behind that larva. Now it's pupating and it's feeding off of the pupa, laying eggs. The eggs hatch. Those eggs mate with once they hatch, they mate with each other. The babies are feeding off of the pupa. There's like multiple life cycles of mites feeding off of this poor little baby, and that baby will either not hatch. Sometimes the bees will pull it out, or that pupa will develop into a fully grown bee, but that bee will have deformed wings. It will have a shorter lifespan. A telltale sign that your hive had too high Varroa mite levels and your bees weren't healthy enough to carry on through winter is that the hive dies. They collapse right around that first real cold night, because they just weren't able to sufficiently cluster up and produce enough heat. They were just too weak. Too many of them were too weak. So it is really important that these winter bees be healthy, even more so than in the springtime. In the springtime, you don't treat. It's not the end of the world. You're just going to taint your honey, which isn't ideal, but so be it. That's not why you get into beekeeping, is to harvest a ton of honey. But if you don't have healthy bees come the late summer for when the queen is laying the eggs for the winter bees, that's going to be a big problem for getting them to survive winter. And then what happens is that a whole bunch of like my retirement cup kind of feel like I've gone into retirement. um, if you um, so then what happens is you treat your hive for mites and you get rid of a good percent of the population, but then a whole bunch of robbing happens because there's not as much food to be gathered, or there's feed inside your hive, or you fed outside the hive. But if you fed it in this feeding station, then there's tons of bees there, and the varroa mites just jump from bee to bee. And so the hive varroa mite levels go through the roof. You should really check out scientificbeekeeping.com. He's got some really interesting charts on there of varroa mite levels throughout the year. The mite levels get really high, and the higher your honeybee population, the higher your mite levels. So you have this like awesome hive that did great all year, and the population is super high. But you know what? The population of mites are super high too. And so then all of a sudden, the population goes way down, but the hive still has a ton of mites. And so then that's a big problem for your beehive. Or the hive just has a lot of robbing that happens because it also had a ton of honey on it. And the varroa mite levels also are high. So then you treat again before you close your hive up for winter. And oxalic acid, I like to use a vaporizer. I do not have a recommendation for the perfect vaporizer because the one I bought I hate. It's just I paid like over $100 for it, and I don't want to go buy a new one. But if anyone has a vaporizer that they like, you should put it in the comments. The one I got is too fat to fit in the entrance, which is super annoying. It is very time consuming to put these little shims on three sides of the beehive to get that stupid vaporizer inside it. But they don't work incredibly well in Hawaii. If you are in a warm tropical climate or a very humid climate, the vaporizer with oxalic acid is not as effective. And also there's brood present. So the oxalic acid does not penetrate through the cells of beeswax. So if you have brood present in the hive, you are going to have to continue to administer oxalic acid for 4 to 5 treatments, about 5 to 7 days apart. It's a real pain in the butt. And that's how most of these treatments work. They don't penetrate through the beeswax. And so that's why they're in for 6 weeks, so that as bees hatch, they are being exposed to it. And then next week, all the next bunch of bees are hatching and they're continuing to be exposed to it. And you get through this like huge amount of brood that now is exposed to this treatment. There's very few things that can penetrate through the beeswax and affect everything, which is why I had really liked that thermal heat treatment, because that did penetrate through the brood, but did not kill the brood or the adult bees. However, they went out of business. If anyone knows of any thermal heat treatments that they've used that do work, let me know. I've heard of some that do not. Okay, so one very, very, very important thing is, what's a vaporizer? A vaporizer is like this stick. It looks like a wand, and it heats up. For mine, I attach it to a small battery, like a motorcycle battery, and you put oxalic acid in this little cup on the wand, and you put it in a beehive, and it creates a vapor within the hive and will kill a lot of the varroa mites on the bees that are walking around in the hive. It doesn't affect the bees that have left the hive, so there's that. And you also have to make sure that the whole hive is sealed up. It's quite a pain. I found it quite a pain in Hawaii because if you've seen any of my videos, you've seen that my equipment has, like, cracks and holes and everything in it, and it's fine in Hawaii, but until you try to use a vaporizer, and then you have to take duct tape and seal up everything, and it's a real pain in the butt. So one thing that's very, very important is when you take out syrup. It's really important that you not feed your bees a liquid syrup when it is getting cold out. You want to feed them. You can make a hard candy, or you can literally just take a bag of dry white sugar and pour it under your lid in the beehive. I've read that the syrup, bees should not be digesting syrup in the winter time. It's not good for them. They need to be able to go out and leave the hive to go on a cleansing flight when they are eating syrup. So, but also I've read that people say that it evaporates and causes even additional moisture in the hive. I don't really know if that's much of a issue, but you want to take the syrup out once you are getting ready to close the hive up for winter. So this is, once bees are clustering, bees cluster up around 65 degrees Fahrenheit is when they'll start to form a loose cluster. So when this is happening in the daytime, your hive should be closed up for winter. Or, if you have like a day or two where that's happening, but then it warms up again, and that's fine. You just have to wait for a warm day to prepare your hive. You just don't want to be rearranging brood and exposing them to this cold weather. Thanks, Blaze, for the contribution. I appreciate it. You don't want to expose your bees to this cold weather, and just taking your whole hive apart. It's one thing to peek under the lid and see if they need more candy or sugar, but it's another to be exposing the bees and the brood to that. So if you're still seeing the queen being active, you're still seeing brood in the hive, you still have days where it's well over 65 degrees Fahrenheit out. I do not know what that is Celsius, sorry guys. Then it's okay, but you just, this is another thing I address in the video that I'm putting out this weekend, the timing. It's always better to be too early than too late. So just do it a little bit earlier if you need to, but don't be a little bit too late. And that's where just finding a place to talk to other local beekeepers is super helpful, or just taking a class, in-person class somewhere, and having all those questions can be helpful. Just so that you can talk to other people. They're not going to tell you exactly what you should be doing, because even if you take a local class or you talk to other local beekeepers, they could be like 30 minutes away, and it might not work for you, or it might not work that winter, or they might not actually be successfully overwintering their hives. But it gives you like a little bit of a benchmark to work from, and talk to other people, and just add them all to the list and come up with a happy medium. All right. Oh, Sam says I was unable to find a Oh, bummer. I thought it said I was able. I was unable to find a thermal unit, so I built my own. I've been testing it on one hive for the last 2 years, and it seems to be working great. Mite levels have been consistently low. Nice. Well, good for you, Sam. How did you build that? Because I want to get my husband to build me one. He's an electrician. He built me my hot box. So, or if you're going to start selling them, please let me know. I'd love to try it out. Why? George says, why do beekeepers depend a lot on the weather? Why do they not sow and maintain a field with rosemary or thyme or lavender with drip irrigation and ensure that bees have everything they need for their hive? Well, I don't really know what rosemary, thyme, and lavender are going to do for bees to have everything they need for their hives. A lot of beekeeping is weather, because that's what tells bees what to do. The The weather decides the flowers, and the flowers decides the bee's health. So beekeepers, it really just depends on where your bees are and whether there is enough food for bees that they can survive. Not all people have the benefit to be able to put enough flowers for the bees. They might have them in an urban environment. Or, I mean, it takes a million flowers to produce a pound of honey. So you can plant some rosemary and thyme and lavender, but ideally you have trees. Trees are what's best for the bees. I mean, I've had bees on macadamia nut farms and near silver oak trees, and um, it's not always enough still. You never know how many other beehives there are nearby. So it's really not enough to just plant some stuff that is good for bees. But as a beekeeper, it's really up to you to decide how much you want to help the bees versus how much you want, like how involved you want to be in their life. So you don't have to get that involved if you don't want to. But that's not really a beekeeper. That's, just then you should just have an environment for bees and not really keep them and let them just, be on their own, which is also acceptable. Um, is it too late to split a hive? Asks Randy. Whether it's too late is really dependent on your area. And I mean, if you're splitting a hive, are you able to buy a queen from somewhere locally? Because that makes a big difference. Are there drones present? Are there drones like that are still in pupa form that are present? Because that's the big question: is not only can you split the hive, but will the bees be able to grow from it? Do you have other beehives that you can give resources to so that they can grow as fast as possible? Or is there still a lot of food present? Are your other hives growing? If your other hives are growing, then you can split the hive and that hive will probably be able to grow. So it's really just a question of, is there enough resources still going on where you are for the bees? Desperate Prepper says, I have one hive with a super. Decided not to harvest this year. Neither are full. I'm in northern Minnesota. They're now eating my sapsuckers jelly. What do you suggest for wintering them? I plan on bringing them into our shed and have the shed regulated to what temperature? Um, I can't just tell you how to overwinter a beehive. Um, the That's a lot of information to give in a little bit of time. I am not familiar with putting beehives into a shed and keeping them in a structure. So if you're in an area that's that cold, I am not really the best person to talk to. That is when I really am just like, it's kind of beyond my experience. I have experience overwintering bees in Pennsylvania, and that's as cold as I have done it. There is one company in Connecticut. I have it in the last. I can put it in the comments after this is over, but he wanted me to try out his hive heater. So you put it, I believe, on the bottom of the hive or on the top or something, and it keeps the hive to a set temperature. I don't know exactly how it runs and how you power it and all that stuff, but that is another option as well. You can wrap your hives, but if you're going to keep it in a shed, then that seems totally unnecessary. Um, And yeah, I mean, you can just buy like one of those hive cozies, or you can wrap it with roofing paper. And yeah, you want to make sure that there's a way for you to be able to get in there and restock the food up at the top when needed. Um, I've never added pollen. I've never fed my bees pollen in the wintertime. But if you don't have any pollen in the hive, then I suppose it would be helpful. I just never, I mean, your bees should be bringing in pollen, and that should be like somewhere inside the hive. So if you already have pollen in the hive, then adding the pollen powder might not be necessary. Um, Canadian Beekeepers blog said fall is here for him. A nice slow flow still coming in. Southern Manitoba, Canada. On coffee break from extracting honey. Have fun with that. So, did you just pull it off the hives? I'm curious because it seems a little late for Canada to be pulling it off the hive, or you're just getting around to spinning it. Kim says, should I not feed pollen now so she doesn't start producing too much? That's something that people just disagree on. I would say if there isn't pollen in the hive, then you can add some pollen to your syrup. And that is assuming that it's still warm enough out that your queen is laying and she is producing winter bees, and you want her to be this winter bee population to be high. But as soon as her laying starts to slow down, or the hive activity is slowing down and there's not much food coming in, then you stop feeding the pollen. But I think it's more important to just make sure there's the honeybee healthy plus amino boost so that they're healthy and they're being encouraged to take to the syrup. The hive should have ample pollen inside it from all summer long. Kim also asks, I treat with oxalic acid and formic acid. Should I do both? You definitely want to just rotate all of the mite treatments. So oxalic acid is best for right before you close the hive up for winter because there's no brood present. If you are going when you treat in the late summer, then you can use something else like formic acid or ape guard. Um, Formic acid has temperature restrictions, so just keep that in mind. And it can cause queen loss if your queen's a little bit older. So if you're going to have difficulty finding a queen to purchase, then you might want to go with Apigard over the Formic this time of year. But if your queens are new this year, then they should be fine. Congratulations on your retirement. Thank you. Beckham says, I'm sorry, I'm driving. Well, that makes sense because the other question was a little confusing, so I skipped over it. How do I protect my nucleus from the other bees or getting there to rob? Yeah, that's a big problem. It's really common for those little beehives to get robbed out and just destroyed. Um, if they're being robbed from your other bees, then feed them. Put a feeder in. You can make a feeding station far, far away from that hive to distract those bees. You can make sure that there's an entrance reducer on that nuke that is as small as possible. At nighttime, you can move it just to get it off their radar, especially if you're doing a feeding station somewhere else or where that nuke used to be. And then you can, if those things still aren't working, you can put a wet white sheet over the nuke. Or, I guess since it's a nuke, maybe even something smaller like a wet white curtain or pillowcase or something. What you're essentially trying to do is you want the bees to be able to exit out of the hive, but you want to make it hard for robbers to figure out how to get in. And so when you change their entrance, when the bees leave for the first time, they're going to remember that this entrance is different. And then when they come back, I mean, some bees are still going to get confused and they're going to be still like flying around, but they'll figure it out and get back in. But it will confuse a lot of the robber bees that didn't have to leave the hive, so don't know how to get in. But since it is a nuke, at nighttime when the bees are back in the hive, I would move it if you can. Make sure to introduce reducers on it and put a feeder out somewhere else to attract your bees to that, or put the feeder where the nuke used to be if you don't have any other bees in that area. Um, Thank you, Becca Medina, for the support as well. I really appreciate you guys supporting my channel. So we're in the process of looking for land, and it's been quite entertaining. If it wasn't my life, I'd be entertained by it. I'm a little unsure how much I want to post to YouTube. I might start a second channel. I don't know if I'll have the time of us finding this little apiary homestead of ours. We found a property that is over 8 acres in a pretty nice area, desirable area, I guess I should describe it as. And 8 acres is kind of unheard of in this space. It is very low in cost because the house is just terrible shape. We're considering that property. We were in the driveway looking at it, and there's like a deer just like standing there next to the car. My son doesn't like it. He said this house needs too much work, is what he said. But that's mostly as like a investment property. I don't know if I actually want to live in that area. Found another property that was beautiful, like my idea of like the perfect property, but it is in a town that I know very little about. It's called Kittnersville. It's right on the Delaware River, up like in northern Bucks County, and the house is a little too small for us. We're seeing a lot of houses built in the 17 and 1800s, which my husband is like, no way, I don't want to deal with that. A lot of houses with in-ground pools, and my husband's like, no way, I don't want to deal with that. So it's been interesting. On the plus side, I have heard about the Clean and Green Act in Pennsylvania. I don't know if people have it in where they are, if there is anyone else here in Pennsylvania, but it gives you a certain percentage off your property taxes if you make at least $2,000 a year in sales on farm production, or you have at least 10 acres of ag land or forested land, or it can be like a forest preserve, but you have to allow people on the property. So that is exciting because taxes are insanely high in the areas we're looking at. Property taxes are very, very, very low on the Big Island, like very, very low. I don't even know if we pay $1,000 a year for property taxes. So I was really surprised when I saw a house in media. Their property taxes were $17,000 a year, and I don't even think it was on 2 acres. It was like a very small. It was not a lot. Made me want to cry. Homesteader says syrup sugar water is impossible here due to the ants. Have tried cinnamon, but I already knew it would be an issue. Interesting. I wonder why the ants are so bad. I mean, the ants are pretty bad here, well, over there in Hawaii, but I never had them. I mean, once in a while, but they usually didn't get into the hive. And I had ants living in the hive. Like I would pull boxes apart and I would see them like carrying eggs around. Well, I wonder what kind of feeder you're using. Have you tried any other feeders that are more like, I don't know. I guess it depends on what feeders you're using already. But there are some feeders that are just like constantly dripping. You definitely don't want that. But there are kind that are a little bit more like a basin or like that frame. You can also just feed them sugar. I mean, you do it in the winter time. It's just you can't add all of those extra supplements to it. Or you could make them candy, then you can add the supplements to it. I guess there would still be a problem with the ants, though. Have you tried feeding like away from the hives? Because even if the ants do get to it, that's, it's so are a ton of other pollinators that aren't your bees, but at least your bees might be also getting some feed too. George says, I was thinking of buying about 4 hectares to sow plants that made the life of the bees easier. That's why I asked. It helps. Every little bit helps, and all that you can buy or plant is going to help the bees, but it's not always enough. And unfortunately, you have mites that feed off of bees. So it's very important to, as the beekeeper, to make your life easier, to help bring down mite levels during certain times of the year so that you're not affecting your honey harvest. And I mean, to a certain extent, like I have said that weather isn't that important when it comes to beekeeping because I haven't noticed a huge difference in keeping bees in Pennsylvania versus Hawaii, despite the temperature difference and the change in climate. Most of it is the same, but you will find out for yourself once I start keeping bees here how well I do and how it goes. Because I didn't have a lot of experience keeping bees in Pennsylvania when I came to Hawaii. I had only been keeping bees a few years before I came to Hawaii, so I really didn't know what I was doing too much. Nam Chivu says, "Wouldn't a heater cause mold?" Good question. A lot of people do have issues with mold in their beehive in the wintertime. I believe that is a big reason why people have an upper entrance to allow for that ventilation, so that it doesn't get too wet inside. But I mean, I'm not sure exactly what temperature. I didn't talk to him too much about how to use it because I told him I don't have any bees this winter to try it on. I'm not exactly sure what temperature you would want to put it at. You might want to just like keep it so that it's not like freezing cold in the hive. I'm not sure. There's a interesting point at which you don't want it too warm or the bees are going to be crawling around all inside the hive all winter long and they're going to be eating a ton of food. So it might just be for like, those really big cold snaps. But I will let you know, I have been talking to him about trying that heater and the guy in France about his smokeless smoker. Now I just need to find someone that's willing to send me a bee suit. I threw mine away when we moved. So I don't have a bee suit. I think I have my veil, but I don't have the hat for it. I think that's snapped. Yeah, and like maybe one beehive. Samuel says, kindly advise me for any grants to set up apiculture and honey processing plants. Honestly, Samuel, I was Googling that just yesterday because I'm sick and it's one of the few times I can lay in bed and not do anything all day. I've been looking for it too. I did not find any. I did find that Clean and Green Act to help with offset the cost of property taxes for farmers because it's a huge expense. I really don't want to spend $10,000-$11,000 a year in property taxes. And it's scary what it's going to be in 10 years, 20 years from now. If that's what people are paying now for that, that's not exactly a house I can retire in if I'm spending $20,000 a year in property taxes. But the next step, once we have the property, is to see where we can, if there's ways that we can get grants to buy equipment and plants for bees. I have friends in the Big Island that bought, I don't know how many acres, like 40 acres or so of land, and they are making it a forest again. The forest kind of, there's like a sandalwood forest higher up on the mountain, and that area has just been destroyed by cows and horses and goats and sheep. There's a lot of ranches. I believe beef is the biggest industry in Hawaii, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, I know tourism is huge too, but the cattle industry is huge in Hawaii. And so, cows just get out, fences break or whatever. Bull is smelling, knows that there's a female cow in heat and breaks the fence. And so a lot of these properties have just been destroyed by the livestock, even if it's not theirs. So they got grants to, they've been planting a ton of native trees, a ton of koa trees and ohia all over their property. And I've been meaning to ask him how he found those grants. I don't know. I just found one website. It is called Farm Raise. They have something like you can pay monthly to get access to all of these grants. Otherwise, with the free membership, they don't give you all the grants. But I looked at some of the grants they had there. I didn't really see anything for pollinators. If anyone else has suggestions for where to go to find grants to support pollinators, please leave them in the comments or email me. Iowa Lands Beekeeping George, year 5. Hive beetles targeted 2 of my best colonies. Do you have experience with hive beetles? Yes, hive beetles are the worst. Yeah, they're terrible. They're really why I almost left Hawaii when I first came. I came to work on a farm with 130 beehives, and when I interviewed them, they're like, "So the hive beetles are kind of destroying the bees here right now, and we now have 30 beehives." And I was like, "Wow, that's a big change." And then they said that I got the job, and they're like, "By the way, we now have 8 beehives." When I got there, they had three beehives because of the hive beetle. It's pretty terrible. I have 2 videos about small hive videos on my small hive beetles on my YouTube channel. I specifically have a if you just go into the search on my channel's page, just put in beetle, they'll come up. Or there's a playlist if you keep scrolling on pests in the hive. But if you have specific questions about hive beetles, let me know. They're very tricky because they are opportunistic. And so now is a big time that they like to take advantage of beehives, especially where it's warm out. When you have excess honey on the hive and the population's getting low, the hive beetle population's getting high, and they will just slowly creep in and start to take over the areas that the bees are not managing. So for people in southern states, it can be a real problem dealing with the hive beetles, because you want to leave the honey for the bees over winter, but right now it's still warm enough. I mean, so if you can, like, a chest freezer was my solution, and it worked really well for me. I just took excess honey off the hives and put it in the hives when I needed it, and it's just a safe place for them. Even once my first chest freezer, because it was just like a 3 cubic foot one, like a real the smallest chest freezer you can buy. Once that one broke, I would put some in the large chest freezer till it was frozen, and then put it in the broken 3 cubic foot one as just an extra space, because it was clean and the gasket, the seal on it, was still good. So I kept all the bugs out. So once I froze the frame, I knew that there was nothing on it that was alive. And I would throw it in the broken one, and then also have my 12 cubic foot chest freezer Um, it's it's a real pain in the butt. There are a lot of beetle traps. I like the beetle traps that go under the hive, and then you want the beetle trap that's under the lid. And you ideally want two traps in the bottom and the top. You don't want to bother the hive too much so that if the bees trap them in the crevices, they have somewhere to go. Ronald says, how much pollen is ample? If you're talking about like on your frames, I mean, I would say that one frame of pollen is more than enough. It's a little tricky because a lot of frames of brood have that little like rainbow arch at the top of pollen and honey. So if you're seeing that on your frames of brood, plus you have a frame in your brood, one of your brood boxes that's like partial pollen and partial honey, I would consider that ample. It's and if your hive is small, then just having pollen on your brood frames is might be enough. I mean, so it depends on what the time of year is that we're referring to. But if you're closing up your hive and you just want to make sure they have some pollen, then you you're going to want some pollen on those. You're going to want some pollen for the brood once the queen starts laying again, which is probably going to be like January, February-ish. And so having a little bit at the top is helpful. If we're talking about like late summer, then whatever the bees gathered over the summertime that you're seeing in the hive, I would think is probably more than enough. Gary says, the bees need to go into winter with young, healthy, fat-bodied honeybees. It's so important. Leave enough honey and pollen patty up is key. Gary has been keeping bees for a very long time. So I would listen to whatever he says. Has a lot more experience in the winter, cold winters than I do, and he is right. Yeah, it's really important. I can't stress it enough. A lot of people just want to put in a treatment before they close the hive up, and they think that's enough. But it's really important that these winter bees are healthy. And these winter bees start as babies, and that's really like this key time that you need their health to be like as good as possible. Emmanuel says, will bees around almond trees produce sweet honey? I'm not really familiar with. I was under the impression that almond trees, the bees just went to for pollen. I'm not really familiar with whether the almond trees produce nectar for the bees. Homesteader says, I thought about a hummingbird type feeder. Yellow jackets sure like it. Yeah, you can try that. My mother-in-law has a lot of hummingbird feeders out. She said that I think she said the ants go to that too. um, Interestingly, somebody has an Etsy shop where they make solar powered fountains, and they sent me one that was like a smaller version of it. That he used as a feeder for bees, and he put syrup in, and he said that the bees like go crazy over it, and he didn't want to sell it to anybody, to non-beekeepers, because he thought that the amount of bees it attracted was too much. I put it out, and not a single bee went to this thing, but ants kept going to it, and it even came with a separate dish to put inside so that you could fill it up with water so the ants couldn't cross over the water to get to the syrup. But it was solar powered, and the little solar panel was separate from the fountain, and there was a very, very long cord between the panel and the fountain, and the ants would climb up onto the cord and walk on the cord over the water to the syrup. The only time I saw bees in this feeder full of syrup I even had it out by the time of year when I didn't think there was much blooming, like in the wintertime. And the only time that bees went to it was when I had just harvested honey and I had these wet frames of comb that, wet frames is when you spin a frame of honey and it's not full of honey, but it still is like wet from honey being all over it. And I left them next to this syrup feeder, and the bees were all over the wet frames. And once those were dry, like 2 bees went to the syrup feeder, but ants were all over it. Ants and geckos love this thing. So I don't know. It's interesting that the ants never really bothered my feeders inside the hive, but the bees never liked the feeders I had outside the hive. They never really took to syrup much at all, even in the slower winter months. I guess there's just always enough for them to forage on. Thank you guys for all of the support. And so much drone activity. Well, if there's a lot of drone activity, then that's good. Because drones are when you have excess. Well, Brandon says almond honey is terrible to eat. I've never heard of almond honey, so I can't. And there's so many beekeepers that bring their hives to the almond orchards. So it's either terrible or they don't produce much of it. All right, 5:06, and I don't see any more questions. So thanks everyone for tuning in and supporting my channel and all this stuff. I apologize for being so slow to post videos these last few months. I have a video I made like months ago, and I just edited it last week, but just haven't finished it with all of this stuff going on. We are on this like mad rush to try to find a house because our realtor said that once October hits, things slowed down considerably. So we were, school just started, and we were really hoping to just find a house and put my son in school and have him start kindergarten when with all of the other kids at the start of the year, and have to avoid renting because we got a pod. The pod arrived on Wednesday. So we've been living out of our 4 suitcases for 5 weeks. The pod took off like 5 days before we moved out of the house. So we needed those suitcases full of stuff for still being in Hawaii. And then the last 4 weeks in Pennsylvania, in which the temperature has been between 50 degrees and 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So our pod, which is like 5 feet by 7 feet by 8 feet, full of stuff arrived, and we have just some boxes of clothes. So we are trying to avoid renting a place because we don't have a table or chairs or a sofa. We actually forgot to pack the television in the pod. The kids are like sitting there watching TV, and it's like 2 days after the pod left, and I'm like, hey Nate, we still have a television in our house. He was like, oh, weren't we supposed to pack that? And I was like, yes. I mean, my computer screen is the same size as our television was. It's not exactly like a big expense or anything. My husband bought that before he met me, which was 9 years ago. But we don't really have anything. So we were hoping to buy a house and then buy everything, not rent a house, buy everything, and then move all this junk to a house. But such is life. Anybody have a suggested town that's good for bees in Pennsylvania? Let me know. East of Harrisburg. I'm open to New Jersey, but I've heard that the schools aren't so great. And the property taxes seem a little high in some of the areas too. So I don't really know what their taxes are going to. We'll see. But And of course, if you have any more information about the other topics we touched on, that thermal heater for mites, that you've tried that works well, or any that you've tried that don't work well, leave them there. If you hear about any grants for beekeepers to plant flowers, or for anybody to create pollinator habitats, please leave them in the chat. It'd be great for everyone to be able to do that and get some compensation for it. Prospecting with Disabilities says, my bees are building combs. Should I let them continue to do this, or should I downsize for winter? They are filling 4 frames in the second deep right now. Leave them be. If it is, 65 degrees out in the daytime, then what you don't want to downsize for winter if your bees are growing. You just need to do it before it's too cold out for you to do it. You don't want to be bothering the bees if they're clustered up and it's 60 degrees outside. So as long as they are happy and building, I mean, that's really all you could ask for, and that's great. And let them do their thing until you're concerned that it's going to be too cold for you to be able to downsize. All right. Have a great weekend, everybody. See you next time. I couldn't find the end stream button for a second there.